So let's return to that breaking news this hour. A $10 billion defamation lawsuit has been brought against the BBC by the United States President Donald Trump.
Indeed, and a trial has been set for February of 2027. That's an order from a judge in Florida.
Well, Panorama faced criticism last year over an episode in 2024 for giving the impression Mr. Trump had encouraged his supporters to storm the Capitol building back in January 2021.
In the episode, a clip from Mr. Trump's speech on January 6th that year was spliced to show him saying the following, quote, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol and I'll be there with you and we'll fight. We fight like hell."
But of course, when he actually said we'll fight like hell, it was nowhere near where he said we're going to walk down to the Capitol. The BBC has, of course, previously apologised for this deceptive edit in this Panorama documentary. But now the President of the United States is bringing a $10 billion lawsuit against the BBC. I mean, this is serious money.
Of course, he's alleging that the BBC has defamed him, as well as violating a Floridian law that bars deceptive and unfair trade practices. Now, initially, he was seeking at least $5 billion in damages for each of the lawsuit's two counts. So that, in total, equates to the $10 billion that we're now hearing. So that, just to reiterate, has been set now for February of 2027, so in a year's time.
Now, the last year we have data for the BBC's total group revenue was 2024-25, that financial year. Their total revenue of the BBC for that year, most recent on record, was £5.9 billion. So what Donald Trump is actually asking for is a little under double the total revenue of the BBC. Almost 2 years of the BBC doing nothing, producing no content, not doing anything with its money other than giving it to the American president.
Essentially what you think he realistically is asking for is the end of the BBC.
Oh.
I don't think that that's a stretch to be saying that, is that if he's going to take, as you rightly say, double their year's revenue in one fell swoop, well, that doesn't really look good for the national broadcaster now, does it? So, yeah, absolutely. Just to reiterate the breaking news from this hour, a US judge has rejected the BBC's application to stay that $10 billion lawsuit brought about by the US President Donald Trump over that Panorama, which edited some of his speech. And that judge has now ordered for a court case to take place in February of next year.
So that means the BBC will be going to trial in Florida in just around a year's time. It's going to be quite the case. And of course, they allow cameras into American courtrooms. So we'll be able to follow this one very closely indeed. The BBC has put up a strident defence up until now, however, saying that there isn't evidence that the president was harmed by this particular documentary. Indeed, the president would have to prove that this particular documentary had been viewed in Florida at the time that it was published in order to have harmed the President of the United States ahead of the last election, which, of course, he did win in Florida and across the rest of the United States of America. So perhaps this is going to be an uphill battle for Trump to actually convince a court that he was harmed by this documentary, which wasn't broadcast in the United States during an election in the United States, which he won. But perhaps, given that he is President of the United States, an incredibly powerful and influential man with all the best lawyers in the land, perhaps he will be able to mount that case.
Well, it's a tricky one, as you say, isn't it? Because the evidence in terms of it being done has been proved. We've seen that Panorama did, in fact, splice those two bits together. So that isn't in dispute. But as you rightly say, it has to be proved that it in some way harmed the US president. And that is going to be the crux of the issue. And I'm sure the prosecutors and the defence, or whatever the terms are in the US. My US judicial system is not on top form. But those two teams will be working very hard to either prove it or to prove that it was not the case. But as you say, Tom, hopefully we'll be getting a live picture from that. In a year's time, we'll be talking about this again and we'll get it live from the courtroom. It'll be very, very interesting to see how that goes. I'm sure a lot of nervousness over at the BBC
Huge
today
amount of nervousness. And there will be pressure on the BBC BBC to settle, to make sure that this doesn't go to court, to ahead of the court date actually settle. Will they do that? Well, let's speak to the former BBC executive producer, David Elstein. David, thanks for joining us on this breaking news. This is a huge amount of money the BBC is being sued for.
Well, it's the amount is nominal. What he actually might get could be anything from naught upwards, but you just specify an amount. And I guess it's meant to terrify the BBC. Whether it does that or not, I don't know.
There's nothing more important than keeping you and your loved ones safe online. With so many VPN options available, choosing the right one can be pretty daunting. And with their Valentine's Day sale, this video's sponsor, ExpressVPN, is making the choice easier for GB News viewers. It's the easiest way to stay safe online, protect your money, and save big for less than £2 a month. Click the link in the video's description or scan the QR code today.
You say it's the amount is nominal, but do you think there will be an amount? Do you think that the US president will ultimately come out the victor of this court case?
Well, I think what was just being said is more likely, which is that there'll now be some attempt at settlement. The reason why today's announcement is significant is that the BBC had been hoping against hope that the court would chuck out the suit on the grounds that the program wasn't broadcast in Florida, and therefore how could President Trump have suffered any damage there, which for many reasons was quite a plausible argument. Unfortunately, doesn't seem to have succeeded, and if the Florida court has accepted the lawsuit, this is the moment of particular danger for the BBC, because what now happens is discovery, where both sides have to hand over to the other all relevant documentation, and that will force the BBC to tell for the very first time, because we just don't know how this happened, who made the decisions to edit the Trump speech in the way that it was, who approved the program for transmission, when the higher-ups in the BBC knew about it, what they did about it, what were the internal processes, what emails were exchanged, what reports were made, and how come it happened twice, once on Newsnight and once on Panorama. So all those declarations of information will be very tricky for the BBC to manage, and very illuminating for us in the UK, because we have not been able to extract any of this information from the BBC. Maybe Donald Trump will.
And that will be the fascinating element of this to follow from a news perspective. But David, in your understanding, will the acceptance of this case by the Floridian justice system have been on the basis of any evidence? Will the Trump legal team have found, I don't know, a British American who resides in Florida and votes in Florida, who might have seen this on holiday or might have a VPN and watched it online illicitly? I mean, might they have
take the stand?
Might they have found an individual who's done that?
No, I doubt if that's the case. Now, if the court haven't said why they're rejecting the BBC arguments yet, I assume at some point they will do, or will be required to do so. And in all kinds of ways, it doesn't really matter, other than possibly going towards quantum of damages. But as I say, the significance here is that the suit has been set for trial.
Yeah.
And once that clock starts ticking, it's almost irrelevant what will happen in the courts in Florida, because the discovery process is going to show that the BBC made a whole series of decisions which have not been revealed as yet, and that, moreover, when they finally revealed what had happened, which was more than a year after the original broadcast, most commentators assumed that therefore the defamation, a defamation suit in the UK couldn't work because it would fall outside the statute of limitations of 1 year. But there's an exception to that rule, and the exception is that if the person who committed the defamation showed bad faith, then it will be arguable for Trump's lawyers to say, we now want to sue in the UK. And in the UK, the BBC obviously will be banged to rights. There's no question that it was broadcast. There's no question that people saw it. There's no question that it was damaging, maybe overstating it, but it certainly was. And Trump consistently misrepresents the whole thing, saying that the BBC put words into his mouth. They didn't. They took words out of his mouth.
But indeed, that gave a misleading impression of what he was telling that crowd to do. David Elstein, we're going to have to leave it there.